Boy bands are not a genre. They are, I don't know, an entity, a force to be reckoned with. Hi, I'm Mahea Sherman. I'm a culture critic and music journalist and the author of Larger Than Life, A History of Boy Bands from NKOTB to BTS. I very quickly realized there were sort of two histories operating in tandem with one another. There's a history of like fangirling in that particular fandom, and then there's a history of male vocal group performance. In my mind, the seed, I guess, of what becomes a boy band is as soon as there's a group of young men, I guess they don't even have to be young, but a group of men singing multi-part harmonies, dressing in a similar fashion, maybe dancing, not necessarily, but there has to be some sort of uniformity. And they're singing secular songs. It's not about religion in any way. And that happens like with barbershop and doo-wop in the 1920s and 1930s and onward. So I think that's kind of like the beginning. And it makes sense that like boy band music would continue to be so lovey-dovey and maybe even a little schmaltzy because that's kind of how it's always been. And then eventually that kind of develops into groups like in the mid-50s, Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, Why Do Fools Fall in Love, which eventually leads to Motown in 1959 and onward, where you get the Temptations and the Four Tops, you know, primarily black male vocal groups singing these very sweet, very PG love songs. But for a lot of people, they sort of see the first boy band in some form to be the Beatles, who form in 1960 and then break up in 1970, which is an interesting idea because the Beatles certainly have the uniform looks. They certainly had their Beatlemaniacs, their fans, and, you know, they're singing, like, love songs. Even, like, I think for a lot of Beatles songs, even, like, if it becomes very sexual or carnal, it's coded. And also, like, I Want to Hold Your Hand, like, there's not, like, what a beautiful boy band sentiment. But they're writing their own songs, and they're playing instruments, which are things that are not traditionally boy band characteristics. They are a foundational boy band as much as they are also a rock band. And they are so interesting because I do think that, like, so much of the Beatles was informed by the Supremes or the Shirelles or the Ronettes and like the like black girl groups of the Motown era. It might just be because of the space and the time that has passed, because we're still talking, oh my God, it's 2021. So like 60, 70 years ago. With that distance, I think most people don't think of that music as boy band music per se. They think of it as more of like Motown music or like the Beatles. It kind of stands on its own outside of this stigmatized two-word phrase, though it's so much a part of this history. In fact, it's kind of what created it. It was really hard to find any sort of etymology of even the phrase boy band. But what I did find was a quote from Lou Pearlman, who is the impresario who created the Backstreet Boys and then NSYNC to compete with the Backstreet Boys, and then O-Town and Aaron Carter and basically anything that was on the hit clip in like the year 2001. He said that the phrase first cropped up in Germany in the 1980s, which would make it very staunchly New Kids on the Block territory, very early New Kids on the Block, and then British boy bands. And that to me is very interesting because it immediately means anything that came before that doesn't get the designation of boy band because we're just now coining the phrase. We're just now learning to use it and what it means. And it also writes out all of the black performers that came before it. If like the first time we're using it is with this white boy band. And I think that's also maybe one of the reasons why a lot of listeners, casual or you know, obsessive like myself, consider New Kids on the Block to be one of the first of like what a boy band is. I like to label it as like the first of like modern boy band, modern in the sense that they are ubiquitous. They're all over the world. They're sort of global. They're highly merchandised. They're like, they have their faces on sheets at JCPenney, and you can get like backpacks and cassettes with their faces, or cassette players rather, with their faces on it and all this stuff. And those are kind of the symbols of boy band that we think about. Obviously, the Beatles were all over the place as well, but it's that instrumentation that kind of takes them out of that idea of the classic boy band for a lot of people. But I will say that's also interesting because if New Kids on the Block are kind of the first of this like modern boy band phenomenon, I should also say this with the heavy caveat of like, because all histories aren't perfect or definitive or even linear. This is how I've learned to digest it from talking to people and doing research. Other people will disagree, and that's cool. And I love to get in arguments about this stuff. But with New Kids on the Block, it's also very interesting because they were created to be the white version of New Edition, another Boston boy band who were like a group of black boys from the Roxbury Projects. And, if they had the same privileges allotted New Kids on the Block, they would have been the sort of first to launch into this trajectory. But they don't get on mainstream radio. They get on urban radio. They are exploited by a series of different people. It's sort of that tragic behind the music, I guess, esque story. It's so interesting. And then, it's sort of just indicative of how much of the music industry is racialized. And that's so unfortunate. And I wanted to make sure I included that in my book because I think it's weird that there's so much like conversation about pop music that in the past that kind of avoids this topic. And with distance, I think it's appropriate to be like, well, here's why boy bands are racist, and here's what's great about them. You can't sort of just pick and choose whatever conversation you want to have. They're all together and intertwined. I always like to joke that if you're into numerology, I think you could probably predict when like the next big boy band's going to break because they do seem to operate on cycles. That joke worked a little bit better before BTS because now I'm like, anything can happen. And the world is so like open and interesting now. But I think for the most part, there is the like New Kids on the Block era. So 80s to early 90s. And then I call it the Y2K era just because that's what I've seen young people refer to it online as, even though it's not totally accurate. But like the late 90s, early 2000s, that is NSYNC, Backstreet Boys, and then all of the sort of like mini-me bands, O-Town, LFO, 98 Degrees. And then in England, like Westlife, E17, Take That. I was like, can't forget Take That. That's kind of like the 90s, 2000s. And I would like say if there is a golden era of boy bands, it's then because that's when they're making the most money. That's when they're all over the place. That's when they're being parodied on like television shows. And obviously with the impact of MTV and TRL, they're sort of all over the place. You're watching them every day. And then after that, there are eras that I outline in the book, but I don't know if they have the same sort of impact. And I think a lot of that is it's just too recent to sort of see with any real distance. But after that, I kind of qualify the next time period to be the Jonas Brothers in the like mid 2000s to like 2010 to that zone. But that's more of like a small era because they weren't as massive as the thing that comes next, which is One Direction in the 2010s or 2015. And then, of course, BTS. Because most people aren't familiar with a lot of K-pop groups other than BTS. I sort of would plant my flag in saying that it's like 2017 to now. We're sort of in that phase because that's when they start appearing on like Jimmy Kimmel. They're on late night television. Your parents are saying, what is this? That's when the era really begins. So it used to be in like 10-year chunks and then it became 5-year chunks. And who knows what happens next if it's going to continue to shrink. There are peaks and valleys, I should say, in the way that I was describing it, because when a boy band comes around, everybody's really excited. They have this thing they're obsessed about. And then that becomes really sort of exhaustive when it's like they're everywhere all the time and you're following their every move. Eventually, public loses interest. And then there's a period where we're just like, give me a soloist or like rappers or rock bands, whatever. And then they kind of appear when they're ready to be beloved again.